I was standing on my front porch in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, sipping my morning coffee when I saw the white pickup truck pull up to my curb. The logo on the side read Heritage Property Services, and my stomach immediately dropped. Nothing good ever came from contractors showing up unannounced at 7 in the morning on a Saturday. 3 men got out, carrying clipboards and wearing high-visibility vests. The tallest one, a guy with a graying beard, walked straight toward my driveway without so much as a glance in my direction. I set my coffee mug down on the porch rail and walked down to meet them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I called out, trying to keep my voice level. The bearded man looked up from his clipboard. "We're here to remove the Windmill. HOA work order. You Blake Sanders?" "I am," I said, feeling my jaw tighten, "and nobody's touching that Windmill." He shrugged like he'd heard it all before. "Sir, we just do what we're told. Got the paperwork right here. Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, Violation Code 7-12-A, unauthorized structure, visual blight, exceeds height restrictions." I walked closer and held out my hand for the paperwork. The work order was dated 3 days ago, signed by Susan Patterson, the HOA president. That name alone made my blood pressure spike. Susan had been a thorn in my side since I moved into this neighborhood 4 years ago. She was one of those middle-aged women who treated the HOA bylaws like they were the 10 Commandments handed down from on high. "This is ridiculous," I said, scanning the document. "That Windmill has been on this property for 83 years. It was here before this neighborhood even existed." The contractor pulled out his phone. "Look, man, I don't make the rules. I just got a call yesterday to come out here and take it down. You got a problem? You need to take it up with your HOA board." "You're not touching it," I repeated, this time with more force. "That Windmill belonged to my grandfather. This property used to be farmland before developers bought up everything around it." Another contractor, younger with a buzz cut, stepped forward. "Sir, if you interfere with HOA authorized work, they can fine you. We've seen it happen." I pulled out my own phone. "And if you set 1 foot on my property without my permission, I'm calling the police. That Windmill is staying exactly where it is." The bearded contractor sighed and made a call. I could hear a woman's voice on the other end, shrill and insistent. After a moment, he handed me the phone. "Mr. Sanders?" Susan Patterson's voice dripped with false sweetness. "I understand there's some confusion about the work order." "There's no confusion, Susan. You can't just order people to tear down a structure that's been here longer than your entire subdivision. Actually, according to our bylaws, any structure that doesn't conform to current neighborhood standards can be ordered removed. Your Windmill is an eyesore that brings down property values. Multiple neighbors have complained." "Multiple neighbors?" I laughed bitterly. "You mean you and your little committee? That Windmill is a piece of history. My grandfather built it himself in 1942. Be that as it may, it violates Sections 7, 12, and 15 of our CC and RS. The board voted unanimously. The structure comes down today, or you'll be fined $500 per day until it's removed." I took a deep breath, trying to control my anger. "Susan, you're making a big mistake. That Windmill is protected." "Protected?" She actually laughed. "By what exactly? Your sentimental feelings?" "We'll see," I said, and hung up on her. The contractors were watching me with a mixture of sympathy and impatience. The bearded one spoke up again. "So what's it going to be? We got other jobs lined up today." "Leave," I said firmly. "I'll deal with the HOA myself." They exchanged glances, and the bearded contractor shrugged. "Your funeral, buddy. Those fines add up fast." I watched them pack up and drive away, then pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my contacts. I needed a lawyer, and I needed one fast. But first, I needed to make another call to someone I should have contacted months ago when Susan first started sending me threatening letters about the Windmill. Margaret Chen at the Iowa State Historical Society answered on the 3rd ring. "Mr. Sanders, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Did you get the letter we sent?" "What letter?" I asked, confused. "Oh no, we mailed it 3 weeks ago to your address. Official notification about the landmark designation." My heart started racing. "Margaret, I never got any letter." "What landmark designation?" There was a pause on the other end. "Your Windmill. After the evaluation we did last spring, the review board approved it for state historical landmark status. It's one of only 12 remaining Depression-era farm windmills in eastern Iowa." The letter was supposed to inform you of the designation and explain the protections that come with it. I felt like I could breathe again for the first time in an hour. Margaret, the HOA just tried to send a crew to tear it down, like an hour ago. They were standing in my driveway. What? Her voice went sharp. They can't do that. Once a structure receives landmark status, it's protected under state law. Any attempt to demolish or significantly alter it without state approval is illegal. Did they actually start work? No. I sent them away, but the HOA president is threatening daily fines if I don't remove it. That's illegal too. Let me get the director on this. In the meantime, I'm going to email you a copy of the landmark designation right now. Print it out, keep it handy, and if anyone shows up again, you show them that document and tell them they'll be prosecuted for destroying state property. State property? I repeated. Well, it's still your property, but the state has a legal interest in preserving it. The penalties for destroying a designated landmark include criminal charges and fines up to $50,000. I'm also going to send a certified letter to your HOA immediately. After I hung up with Margaret, I went inside and fired up my computer. Sure enough, there was an email waiting with a PDF attachment. I read through it twice, my smile growing wider with each paragraph. The Windmill had been designated as an Iowa State Historical Landmark on May 15th, nearly 6 weeks ago. The letter explained that this status provided legal protection against demolition, required any maintenance or repairs to follow historical preservation guidelines, and made the site eligible for state historical markers and potential grant funding for restoration. I printed out 5 copies and tucked one in my wallet. Then I sat down and wrote an email to Susan Patterson, attaching the landmark designation letter. I kept it brief and professional, but I couldn't resist a little bit of satisfaction in my tone. Susan, as you can see from the attached document, the windmill on my property has been designated as an Iowa State Historical Landmark. This designation makes it illegal to demolish or significantly alter the structure without state approval. Any attempts to do so may result in criminal prosecution and fines up to $50,000. I suggest the board withdraw the work order immediately. Regards, Blake Sanders. I hit send and leaned back in my chair. My grandfather would have gotten a kick out of this. John Sanders had been a tough old farmer who'd survived the Dust Bowl and the Depression. He'd built that windmill by hand, using scrap metal and parts salvaged from a broken tractor. It had pumped water for his livestock and his vegetable garden through decades of droughts and hard times. When he died, he left the farm to my father, who eventually sold off most of the land to developers, but kept the original 2-acre homestead where the farmhouse and windmill stood. When my father passed 5 years ago, I inherited it. At first, I'd considered selling and buying something more modern, but standing in that old farmhouse, looking out at the windmill my grandfather built, I couldn't do it. Instead, I renovated the house, updated the plumbing and electrical, and made it my home. The windmill stayed exactly where it was, a testament to my family's history and resilience. The HOA had been formed 2 years ago when the neighborhood reached a certain number of homes. I'd voted against it, but I was outnumbered. Susan Patterson had moved in about the same time and immediately positioned herself as the champion of property values and neighborhood standards. She'd been elected HOA president within 6 months, running on a platform of strict enforcement and zero tolerance for violations. At first, the violations were minor. My grass was half an inch too long. I'd left my trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day. My mailbox needed repainting. I paid the small fines and tried to comply, figuring it wasn't worth the fight. But then Susan set her sights on the windmill. She claimed it was ugly, dangerous, and brought down property values. She showed up at my door with a petition signed by 8 neighbors demanding its removal. I told her politely but firmly that it wasn't going anywhere. That was 3 months ago. Since then, the letters had escalated from requests to demands to threats. Now, apparently, she decided to skip the formalities and just have it torn down. My phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. Mr. Sanders, this is Patricia Wu from Riverfront Legal Services. Margaret Chen from the Historical Society asked me to give you a call. That was fast, I said. Margaret and I go way back. She filled me in on your situation. I'd like to help if you're interested. This kind of thing is actually right in my wheelhouse. I've handled several cases involving HOA, overreach, and historical preservation conflicts. What would it cost? I asked, knowing lawyers didn't come cheap. First consultation is free. After that, honestly, I don't think this will require much work. You've got the law solidly on your side. The landmark designation is ironclad. The HOA can't touch that windmill, period. I'll send them a formal letter explaining the legal situation, and that should be the end of it. You don't know Susan Patterson, I said dryly. Patricia laughed. Oh, I know the type. But here's the thing. HOA board members can be held personally liable if they knowingly violate the law. Once I explained that Susan could be facing criminal charges and massive fines if she continues pursuing this, she'll back down. They always do. I hope you're right. Trust me. Can you come by my office Monday morning? I'm downtown, 3rd Street across from the courthouse. Say 9 o'clock? I agreed and hung up feeling more confident. Then I spent the rest of Saturday waiting for the other shoe to drop. Susan didn't call or email back. That silence felt ominous. Sunday morning, I was mowing my lawn when a silver Lexus pulled into my driveway. Susan Patterson got out, wearing white capri pants and a pink blazer that screamed suburban authority figure. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her face was set in an expression I'd come to recognize as her "I'm being patient, but you're testing me" look. Blake, we need to talk, she said, not bothering with pleasantries. I shut off the mower. I sent you the landmark letter. There's nothing to talk about. That letter's irrelevant. Our CC and Rs supersede any so-called landmark designation. I stared at her in disbelief. Susan, that's not how the law works. State law trumps HOA bylaws. Our legal team disagrees. She pulled out a folder from her designer handbag. We consulted with our HOA attorney, and he assures us that homeowner covenants are legally binding contracts that take precedence over discretionary state designations. Your attorney is wrong, I said flatly. And if you proceed with trying to remove that windmill, you and the entire board will be breaking the law. Her smile was cold. We're prepared to pursue this through the proper legal channels, but I'm here to offer you a compromise. Remove the windmill voluntarily, and we'll waive all fines and penalties. You could even receive a reimbursement for the removal costs. How generous, I said sarcastically. The answer is no. You're making this much harder than it needs to be. The windmill is an embarrassment to this neighborhood. Half the board members are getting complaints from potential buyers whose realtors steer them away because of that rusty eyesore on your property. Then those buyers can buy somewhere else, I said. This is my home, my land, and my family's history. The windmill stays. Susan's expression hardened. Fine. But when the fines start piling up and we place a lien on your property, don't say I didn't try to work with you. You do that, and I'll sue the HOA for harassment and violation of state law. And Susan, my lawyer tells me board members can be held personally liable. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, but she recovered quickly. We'll see what a judge says. She got back in her Lexus and drove off, leaving me standing in my half-mowed lawn, wondering just how far she was willing to push this. Monday morning, I met with Patricia Wu at her office. She was younger than I expected, probably mid-30s, with dark hair cut in a sharp bob and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I've already sent the formal letter to your HOA board, she said, sliding a copy across her desk. I explained the legal protections afforded by the landmark designation and outlined the penalties for violations. I also made it clear that any fines or liens placed on your property related to the windmill would be invalid and actionable. Susan came to my house yesterday and basically said their attorney told them they could ignore the landmark status. Patricia raised an eyebrow. Who's their attorney? She didn't say. Doesn't matter. They're wrong, dead wrong. And if they proceed, we'll file for an injunction and possibly pursue damages for harassment. She leaned forward. Blake, I want you to document everything. Every letter, every fine notice, every conversation. If they escalate this, we need a clear record. I've been keeping everything, I assured her. Good. I'm also going to reach out to the State Historical Society and make sure they send their official letter directly to the HOA board, multiple certified copies. That way there's no question that the board was formally notified. Over the next week, things got weird. I received a formal fine notice in the mail, $500 for failure to comply with the work order. I forwarded it to Patricia, who immediately sent another letter threatening legal action. Then I got a second notice, another $500, and a third. The HOA was literally fining me daily despite having been notified that what they were doing was illegal. On Thursday, Patricia called me sounding genuinely angry. Your HOA just sent me a letter threatening to place a lien on your property for unpaid fines totaling $3,500. 7 days times 500, I calculated. They're serious. They're insane, Patricia corrected. I'm filing an emergency motion for an injunction tomorrow morning. This has gone beyond stupid into potentially criminal territory. Friday afternoon, I got a knock on my door. It was a Cedar Rapids police officer, young guy with a friendly face. Mr. Sanders, I'm Officer Mike Torres. I need to talk to you about a complaint we received. My stomach sank. What kind of complaint? Your HOA filed a report claiming you have a dangerous structure on your property that poses a public safety hazard. I'm required to do a welfare check and assess the situation. I stepped aside and let him in, then walked him through the back door so he could see the windmill. It stood about 30 feet tall, constructed from metal and wood, its blades currently still in the light breeze. Officer Torres walked around it slowly, examining it from different angles. Has this been here long? He asked. Since 1942, my grandfather built it. It's actually a state historical landmark now. I showed him the documentation. He read through it carefully, then handed it back. Looks solid enough to me. I'm not a structural engineer, but I don't see any immediate danger. The base is concrete, the metal looks maintained, and it's not like it's going to fall over in a stiff wind. So what happens with the complaint? I'll file a report stating I found no evidence of a public safety hazard. If your HOA wants to pursue it further, they'd need to hire an actual engineer to do an assessment, and even then, with this landmark status, I don't think they can force you to do anything. After he left, I called Patricia and filled her in. She sighed heavily. They're grasping at straws. The hearing for the injunction is Monday at 10. Can you be there? Wouldn't miss it. That weekend felt like the calm before the storm. I spent Saturday working on the windmill, oiling the gears and doing some minor repairs to the wooden platform. My grandfather had taught me how to maintain it when I was a kid, and I'd kept up the tradition. It still worked perfectly, though I'd capped the well it used to pump from years ago. Sunday evening, my neighbor Tom Bradley came over. Tom was retired military, a straight shooting guy in his 60s who'd always been friendly. Blake, I wanted to give you a heads up, he said, looking uncomfortable. Susan's been going door to door trying to get signatures for some kind of petition against you. My wife and I told her to get lost, but I know she got a few people to sign. What kind of petition? Something about removing you from the neighborhood for being a nuisance. I don't think it's legally binding, but she's stirring up trouble. The Hendersons signed it, and the Martins. I wasn't surprised about the Hendersons. They were a young professional couple who'd bought one of the McMansions on the corner and seemed to think the whole neighborhood should look like a magazine spread. The Martins were retirees who pretty much did whatever Susan told them to do. Thanks for the warning, Tom. That windmill's been there longer than any of us, he said firmly. Susan's got no right to demand you tear down a piece of history. A bunch of us think she's gone off the deep end with this power trip. Monday morning, I put on my best suit and met Patricia at the Lynn County Courthouse. The HOA was represented by their attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit named Richard Frost. Susan was there too, along with 2 other board members, David Chen, the treasurer, and Linda Morrison, the secretary. The hearing was in front of Judge Helen Caraway, a stern-looking woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. Both sides presented their arguments. Richard Frost tried to claim that HOA covenants were legally binding contracts and that the landmark designation was a recent development that couldn't retroactively override existing agreements. Patricia methodically destroyed his argument. She presented the landmark designation, state law regarding historical preservation, and case law demonstrating that state regulations supersede HOA bylaws in matters of historical preservation. She also pointed out that the HOA had continued to fine me even after being officially notified of the landmark status, which demonstrated bad faith. Judge Caraway listened to everything, asked a few pointed questions, then made her ruling. The state landmark designation clearly takes precedence over homeowner association bylaws. Mr. Sanders is legally protected from being forced to alter or remove the windmill. Furthermore, the HOA's continued assessment of fines after being notified of the landmark status appears to constitute harassment. I'm granting the injunction. The HOA is hereby ordered to cease all fines, penalties, and collection actions related to the windmill. All previous fines are voided and must be removed from Mr. Sanders' account. Any future action taken regarding the windmill will be considered contempt of court. Susan's face went white, then red. Richard Frost looked professionally annoyed. Patricia looked satisfied. As we left the courtroom, Susan blocked my path in the hallway. "This isn't over," she hissed. "Actually, it is," Patricia said smoothly. "And if you continue to harass my client, we'll pursue a restraining order. I'd also advise you to consult with your attorney about the potential liability you've exposed yourself and the board to by continuing to assess fines after being notified that you were violating state law." We walked past her, and I felt like I could finally relax. But I should have known better. 2 days later, I came home from work to find a news van parked on my street. A reporter and cameraman were filming my windmill from the sidewalk. I parked in my driveway and got out cautiously. The reporter, a woman in her 30s with perfect hair and a bright smile, approached me with a microphone. "Mr. Sanders, I'm Jessica Park from KCRG-TV9. We're doing a story about your battle with the HOA over your historical windmill. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" I hesitated, then figured the truth couldn't hurt. Sure. She asked me about the windmill's history, my grandfather, the HOA's actions, and the court ruling. I explained everything as clearly as I could. Then she asked if Susan Patterson had been contacted for comment. We reached out to the HOA board, and Ms. Patterson gave us a statement saying that the board acted in good faith to maintain neighborhood standards and that they respect the court's decision. That sounded surprisingly reasonable for Susan. I should have been suspicious. The story aired that night on the evening news. It was actually well done, focusing on the windmill's history and the importance of preserving local landmarks. They interviewed Margaret Chen from the Historical Society, who talked about the windmill's significance. They showed old photos from the 1940s of my grandfather standing next to it. But they also included Susan's interview, and that's where things went south. "While we respect the court's decision," Susan said on camera, looking earnest and reasonable, "I think it's important to note that this situation highlights the tension between individual property rights and community standards. Many residents have expressed concerns about how this windmill affects their property values and the overall aesthetic of our neighborhood. We hope Mr. Sanders will consider voluntarily taking steps to address these concerns, perhaps by painting or renovating the structure to better fit with the neighborhood's appearance." I stared at the TV in disbelief. She was still pushing, just more subtly now. The next day, I got a letter from the HOA, not a fine this time, but a friendly suggestion that I consider painting the windmill or adding decorative elements to make it more visually appealing and harmonious with neighborhood standards. I called Patricia. She's still at it. "I saw the news story. That letter's toothless, Blake. It's a suggestion, not a requirement. They can't force you to do anything. They're just trying to save face." "Should I respond?" "Ignore it. Don't engage. They're hoping you'll react and they can claim you're being difficult or uncooperative." I took her advice and threw the letter away. But the situation had taken on a life of its own. The news story had apparently touched a nerve because suddenly everyone had an opinion about my windmill. I got messages of support from people I'd never met. A local preservation society reached out to offer help if I needed it. But I also got nasty emails from people saying I was selfish and stubborn, that I should compromise, that property values mattered more than my sentimental attachment to an old piece of junk. The HOA Facebook page, which I'd been kicked off months ago, apparently erupted into a civil war. Tom showed me screenshots. Half the neighborhood was defending the windmill as a piece of history worth preserving. The other half was parroting Susan's line about property values and neighborhood standards. Susan and her supporters were trying to organize another petition, this time calling for my voluntary compliance with aesthetic guidelines. It all came to a head at the next HOA board meeting, which was open to all residents. I hadn't planned to attend, but Tom convinced me I should. "You need to defend yourself," he said. "Susan's been spreading rumors that you're planning to turn your property into some kind of tourist attraction, that you're going to put up signs and charge admission. It's complete garbage." But people are believing her. So I went. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland building at the entrance to the neighborhood. The room was packed. I counted at least 60 people, way more than usually attended these things. Susan sat at the head table with David Chen, Linda Morrison, and two other board members I barely knew, Gary Foster and Brenda Walsh. Susan called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a prepared statement about the Windmill situation. She framed it as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining neighborhood standards and how outside interference from state agencies threatened local control. "While we must comply with the court's decision," she said, "I want to make it clear that the board acted appropriately to enforce our CC and RS. We were not aware of the landmark designation, which was apparently processed without proper notification to the HOA." That was a lie. Margaret Chen had sent the letter 3 weeks before the HOA tried to tear down the Windmill, but I kept my mouth shut and waited for the public comment period. When it finally came, hands shot up all over the room. Susan tried to call on her supporters first, but Tom was faster. "I'd like to speak in support of Blake Sanders," he said loudly. "That windmill has been part of this property longer than any of us have lived here. It's a piece of local history. And frankly, I think it's shameful that the board tried to destroy it without even doing basic research." Applause broke out from about half the room. Susan's face tightened. "Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Next comment?" A woman I didn't recognize stood up. "I moved here because this is supposed to be a well-maintained upscale neighborhood. That windmill looks like something from a junkyard. It brings down all our property values, and I don't think one person's nostalgia should matter more than the financial interests of the entire community." More applause, this time from the other half of the room. This went on for 30 minutes. People argued passionately on both sides. Some brought up property value studies. Others talked about the importance of preserving history. It got heated enough that Susan had to threaten to end the public comment period if people didn't stay civil. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I stood up, and the room went quiet. "I didn't ask for any of this," I said. "I just wanted to live in my grandfather's house and honor his memory by maintaining the windmill he built with his own hands. I wasn't trying to defy the HOA or make a statement. But when the board tried to tear down a piece of my family's history without even talking to me first, without doing any research into whether they had the right, I had to fight back." I looked directly at Susan. "The windmill isn't going anywhere. It's protected by state law. But more than that, it represents something important. My grandfather survived the Depression. He fought in World War II. He built that windmill when times were hard and water was scarce. It's a testament to the kind of determination and craftsmanship that built this country. And honestly, if you can't see the value in that, if all you see is how it affects your property values, then I feel sorry for you." The room erupted. Some people stood and clapped, others shouted disagreements. Susan banged her gavel and called for order. The meeting eventually ended without any resolutions. As people filed out, several neighbors came up to shake my hand and offer support. But I also got dirty looks from others who clearly thought I was a stubborn jerk ruining their neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, things started to calm down. The news cycle moved on to other stories. The HOA Facebook group's arguments died down. Susan stopped sending me letters. I thought maybe, finally, it was over. Then I got a call from Margaret Chen. "Blake, I wanted to give you some good news. The Historical Society is planning to install an official state historical marker at your property. It's a bronze plaque that will be mounted on a post near the windmill, explaining its history and significance. We'll handle all the costs and installation. I just need your permission." "Absolutely," I said. "That sounds great." "There's more. We're also applying for a grant to help with restoration and maintenance. The windmill is in decent shape, but with proper restoration, it could last another 100 years. Would you be interested in that?" "Very interested." The historical marker went up 3 weeks later. It was beautiful, an official bronze plaque with the state of Iowa seal at the top. It read, "Sanders Farm Windmill. Constructed 1942 by John Sanders. This Depression-era farm windmill represents the ingenuity and resilience of Iowa farmers during one of the most challenging periods in American history. Hand-built using salvaged materials, it provided water for livestock and crops for over 50 years. Designated Iowa State Historical Landmark, 2026. Margaret came out for a small ceremony. A few neighbors attended, including Tom and his wife. Even the local paper sent a reporter. It was a nice moment, dignified and meaningful. Susan Patterson drove by twice during the ceremony, but didn't stop. A week later, I got a certified letter. It was from the HOA, but it wasn't signed by Susan. It was signed by David Chen as acting board president. Dear Mr. Sanders, the board wishes to inform you that Susan Patterson has resigned as HOA president effective immediately. The board has voted to issue a formal apology for the mishandling of the situation regarding your historical windmill. We acknowledge that the board acted improperly in attempting to remove a legally protected structure and in continuing to assess fines after being notified of its landmark status. All records of fines and violations related to the windmill have been permanently removed from your account. We hope to move forward with a more collaborative relationship. Sincerely, David Chen, Acting President, Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I read it twice, hardly believing it. Susan had resigned, or been forced out. Either way, she was gone. Tom filled me in on what had happened. Apparently, several board members and a group of residents had started asking questions about the HOA's legal bills. The fight over my windmill had cost the HOA over $15,000 in legal fees. Richard Frost, their attorney, had billed them for all the court appearances, letters, consultations, and research. When people found out how much money had been wasted on a fight the HOA was legally guaranteed to lose, they were furious. There was an emergency meeting, Tom explained. About 30 people showed up demanding answers. David Chen went through the financials and showed everyone exactly how much Susan's crusade cost. Then, someone asked if the board members could be held personally liable for knowingly violating state law after being notified. That's when Brenda Walsh and Gary Foster both announced they were resigning from the board. Susan tried to defend herself, but people started shouting her down. She resigned on the spot and walked out. Wow, I said. Yeah, David's actually a decent guy. He voted with Susan on the windmill thing initially, but he told me later he didn't realize it was a landmark. Once the court ruled, he wanted to drop it, but Susan kept pushing. He's been working behind the scenes to clean up the mess. Life slowly returned to normal. The new board under David Chen's leadership was much more reasonable. They focused on actual neighborhood issues like road maintenance and community events, not on power trips and petty violations. I even volunteered to help organize a neighborhood history project, sharing old photos and stories about the area before it became a subdivision. The restoration grant came through 6 months later. A team of specialists from the Historical Society spent 2 weeks carefully restoring the windmill. They replaced some rotted wood, treated the metal for rust, and made sure all the mechanical components were sound. When they finished, the windmill looked better than it had in decades, while still maintaining its authentic appearance. I started giving occasional tours for local school groups and history buffs who wanted to see it. Nothing commercial, just informal visits where I'd share my grandfather's story and explain how the windmill worked. The kids loved it, especially when I'd let the blades turn in the wind. One Saturday afternoon, about a year after the whole mess started, I was out working in my garden when a silver Lexus pulled up to my curb. My stomach clenched instinctively. Susan Patterson got out and I braced myself for another confrontation. But she looked different. Smaller somehow, less aggressive. She walked up my driveway slowly. "Blake, I'm not here to cause trouble," she said before I could speak. "I just wanted to apologize." I stood there with my gardening gloves on, too surprised to respond immediately. "I was wrong," she continued, not meeting my eyes. "About the windmill, about how I handled everything. I let my need to control things get out of hand. I cost the HOA a lot of money and caused a lot of conflict that didn't need to happen. And I nearly destroyed something important because I couldn't see past my own narrow view of how things should be." "Okay," I said cautiously. "I've been doing some therapy," she said with a small, embarrassed laugh. "Working on why I need to control everything so much. Anyway, I saw the restored windmill from the road, and it actually looks really beautiful. I can see why it matters to you. So I wanted to say I'm sorry, and I hope you can accept that, even though I don't deserve it." I took off my gardening gloves and stuck out my hand. "Apology accepted." She shook it, looking relieved. "Thank you." After she left, I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then I went back to my gardening, glancing occasionally at the windmill standing tall against the blue Iowa sky. That night, I called my cousin Rachel, who lived in Oregon. She was John Sanders' granddaughter too, and she'd always loved hearing stories about the old farm. "The windmill's officially protected now," I told her. "State historical landmark, restored, the whole 9 yards. Grandpa John would have gotten a kick out of all the fuss." "He really would have," Rachel said, laughing. "Remember how he used to say that windmill was the most useful thing he ever built? He'd be so proud that it's still standing." "I'm thinking about writing down all his stories," I said. "Everything he told us about building it, about the farm, about surviving those years. Maybe the Historical Society would want it for their archives." "That's a great idea. I've got some old letters and photos you could use too. He wrote to my grandmother during the war, and she kept everything." We talked for an hour, sharing memories and making plans. After I hung up, I walked outside and stood in my backyard, looking up at the windmill silhouetted against the darkening sky. The blades turned slowly in the evening breeze, just like they'd been turning for more than 80 years. My grandfather had built it to serve a practical purpose, to pump water and keep his farm alive during hard times. But it had become something more over the decades. It was a connection to the past, a reminder of resilience and ingenuity, a physical link to family history that you could see and touch. The whole fight with the HOA seemed almost surreal now. All that anger and conflict over a structure that Susan had seen as an eyesore and I'd seen as irreplaceable. We'd both been so certain we were right, so dug into our positions. It had taken a court order and $15,000 in legal fees for the situation to finally resolve. And even then, it wasn't really over until Susan had come to her own realization that she'd been wrong. I thought about the neighbors who'd supported me and the ones who'd opposed me. The community had been genuinely divided, not because people were malicious, but because they had different values and priorities. Property values versus historical preservation. Uniformity versus individuality. Community standards versus personal freedom. Those weren't easy questions, and reasonable people could disagree. But some things, I thought, shouldn't be up for debate. Some things matter more than aesthetics or property values. History matters, family matters, the physical reminders of where we came from and who built the world we inherited, those matter too. The Historical Society had been right to designate the windmill as a landmark. It wasn't just my family's history, it was Iowa's history, America's history. It represented a time when people built things by hand because they had to, when ingenuity and determination were the difference between survival and failure. Over the following months, I became more involved with local preservation efforts. Margaret Chen invited me to join the Historical Society's advisory board, and I accepted. We worked on identifying and protecting other historical sites in the area. I learned about old barns, bridges, and buildings that were at risk of being demolished or left to decay. Each one had a story, a connection to the past that would be lost forever if we didn't act to preserve it. I also started attending HOA meetings again, not as an adversary, but as a participant. David Chen turned out to be a thoughtful leader who actually listened to residents and tried to find reasonable solutions to problems. The board under his leadership was more transparent, more collaborative, and less focused on enforcement and punishment. One meeting, about 18 months after the windmill fight, David brought up the idea of creating a neighborhood history display in the community center. "We've got a lot of newer residents who don't know anything about this area's agricultural history," he said. "I think it would be valuable to have some photos and information about what this land looked like before it was developed." I volunteered to help put it together. We gathered old photographs, maps, and documents showing the farms that had once covered this area. I contributed photos of my grandfather and the windmill, of the farmhouse before renovation, of the fields that had been plowed under to make room for streets and houses. The display opened with a small reception at the community center. About 40 residents came, including some who'd been on Susan's side during the original conflict. People were genuinely interested in the history. They asked questions about the families who'd farmed here, about what crops they grew, about how the land had changed. One woman, Jennifer Henderson, who'd signed Susan's petition against me, approached me near the end of the evening. "I never knew about any of this," she said, looking at the photos. "When we moved here, I just saw it as a nice suburban neighborhood. I didn't think about what was here before." "Most people don't," I said. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I signed that petition because Susan made it sound like you were just being stubborn and difficult. I didn't understand what the windmill meant, why it mattered. Looking at these pictures, seeing your grandfather standing next to something he built with his own hands, I get it now." "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot." The history display became a permanent fixture in the community center. David had it professionally mounted and lit, with a plaque crediting the various residents who'd contributed. It became something people showed to visitors, a point of pride for the neighborhood. 2 years after the whole mess started, the Windmill appeared in a coffee table book about Iowa's agricultural heritage. The photographer spent a whole day at my house taking pictures from different angles and in different light. The book came out 6 months later, and there on page 73 was a gorgeous full-page photo of the windmill at sunset, with the restored blade silhouetted against an orange and purple sky. The caption read, "The Sanders Farm Windmill, Cedar Rapids, built 1942 by John Sanders. This hand-constructed windmill served a small family farm through decades of droughts and economic hardship. Now protected as a state historical landmark, it stands as a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of Depression-era farmers." I bought 10 copies of the book and sent them to relatives across the country. Rachel called me crying when she got hers. "Grandpa John would have been so proud," she said. "He never would have believed his old windmill would end up in a book." The story of the HOA fight had become something of a local legend. People brought it up at parties and community events, usually in the context of HOA overreach or the importance of preserving history. I'd become known as the Windmill Guy, which was fine by me. Patricia Wu and I stayed in touch. She'd handled the case so efficiently that her total bill had been less than $3,000, a fraction of what the HOA had paid Richard Frost to fight a losing battle. She occasionally used my case as an example when talking to other clients facing HOA problems. "Your situation had everything," she told me once over coffee. "Clear legal protections, obvious overreach, a sympathetic defendant, and opponents who just kept digging themselves deeper. It's a perfect teaching case." Margaret Chen told me the windmill had become one of the most visited landmarks in their database. Schools requested tours, photography clubs came out to shoot it, and history buffs made pilgrimages to see it in person. The Historical Society was considering using it as a centerpiece for a broader initiative to identify and protect other Depression-era farm structures across Iowa. "You really started something," Margaret said. 5 years ago, nobody was paying attention to these old windmills. Most of them were being torn down without anyone caring. Now we've got momentum to save others before they disappear." The restoration grant had included money for ongoing maintenance, so every 2 years a crew from the Historical Society came out to inspect the windmill and do any necessary work. It was being properly cared for now, preserved not just for my lifetime, but for generations to come. 3 years after the fight, I was contacted by a filmmaker from Iowa Public Television who wanted to do a documentary about historical preservation in Iowa. The windmill would be one of the featured sites. They spent 2 days filming, interviewing me about my grandfather, the HOA battle, and why preservation mattered. The documentary aired 6 months later and was well received. It framed the windmill story as an example of successful community advocacy for preservation, though it was careful to be fair to all sides. They interviewed Susan Patterson, who talked honestly about her mistakes and what she'd learned. They interviewed David Chen about how the HOA had changed its approach to enforcement and community relations. And they interviewed several neighbors who explained how the windmill had become a source of neighborhood pride rather than division. After the documentary aired, I got letters from people across the state and even from other states, sharing their own stories of fights to preserve historical sites. Some had won their battles, others had lost. Many asked for advice or just wanted to share their frustration with bureaucracies that valued conformity over preservation. I responded to every letter, offering encouragement and practical advice when I could. Patricia Wu had taught me a lot about how to navigate these conflicts, and I was happy to pass that knowledge along. The windmill itself remained unchanged through all of this, steadily turning in the Iowa wind just as it had for decades. It had survived the Depression, World War II, the farm crisis of the 80s, and now an HOA board's attempt to destroy it. It would probably still be standing long after I was gone, a silent witness to the passage of time and the persistence of history. On the 4th anniversary of the day the contractors had shown up to tear it down, I organized a small celebration. I invited Margaret Chen, Patricia Wu, Tom Bradley, and other supportive neighbors, and my cousin Rachel flew in from Oregon. We stood in my backyard on a beautiful June afternoon, looking up at the restored windmill. "To John Sanders," I said, raising a glass of lemonade, "who built something that lasted." "To John Sanders," everyone echoed. We spent the afternoon sharing stories, eating barbecue, and watching the windmill blades turn. Tom's grandson, a kid about 10 years old, asked me 100 questions about how it worked and what it was like in the old days. I did my best to answer, drawing on memories of things my grandfather had told me decades ago. "Will it really be here forever?" the boy asked. "Nothing's forever," I said, "but it's protected now. As long as people care about preserving history, as long as we remember why these things matter, it'll be here." As the sun set and the party wound down, I found myself alone with the windmill again. I walked up to it and put my hand on the old metal frame, feeling the slight vibration as the blades turned overhead. "We did it, Grandpa," I said quietly. "Your windmill is safe." The blades creaked gently in the evening breeze, and I smiled. After everything, after all the conflict and stress and anger, it had all been worth it. The windmill stood as proof that some battles are worth fighting, that history is worth preserving, and that sometimes, if you stand your ground and fight for what's right, you can actually win. The HOA had sent a crew to tear down my windmill. They'd threatened fines and liens and legal action. They'd tried to force me to surrender a piece of my family's legacy to their vision of neighborhood conformity. But they'd frozen when the landmark letter reached the board, realizing too late that they'd picked a fight they couldn't win, trying to destroy something that was protected by laws bigger and more important than their bylaws. And now that windmill stood restored and protected, a designated historical landmark that would be preserved for future generations. My grandfather's handiwork, his Depression-era ingenuity, had outlasted threats and challenges I'm sure he never could have imagined when he built it back in 1942. I went back inside as darkness fell, leaving the windmill to stand watch over the neighborhood as it had for over 80 years. Tomorrow I'd get back to my normal life, but tonight I allowed myself to feel satisfied with how everything had turned out. The house was quiet as I made myself dinner and settled in for the evening. Looking out my kitchen window at the windmill's dark silhouette against the night sky, I thought about all the people who'd played a role in this story. Susan, who'd learned some hard lessons about the limits of authority and the importance of respecting history. David Chen, who'd stepped up to lead the HOA in a better direction. Patricia Wu, who'd fought skillfully to protect my rights. Margaret Chen and the Historical Society, who'd recognized the windmill's significance and moved to protect it. And all the neighbors who'd supported me, who'd stood up at that board meeting and said that history mattered more than uniformity. It had taken a village, in a way, to save one old windmill. But we'd done it. And in the process, we'd reminded ourselves and our community that preservation isn't just about protecting old buildings or structures. It's about honoring the people who came before us, the work they did, the lives they lived. It's about maintaining physical connections to our past so that future generations can understand where they came from. The next morning, I woke up to find an email from a professor at the University of Iowa. She was teaching a class on public history and heritage preservation, and she wanted to know if she could bring her students out to see the windmill and hear about the fight to save it. "Your case has become something of a touchstone in preservation circles," she wrote. "It's a perfect example of how landmark designation can protect important historical resources, and also how communities can come together to value history over aesthetics." I wrote back agreeing to host the class visit. It was scheduled for 2 weeks later. When the day came, 20 college students showed up with notebooks and cameras. I gave them a tour of the windmill, explained its history and construction, and then told them the whole story of the HOA battle. They asked smart questions about the legal process, about community organizing, about how to identify sites worth preserving. One student asked whether I'd ever considered giving up when the fines were piling up and the fight seemed endless. Honestly? Yeah, there were moments when I thought about just giving in, I admitted. It would have been easier. But every time I looked at that windmill and thought about my grandfather building it with his own hands, I knew I couldn't let it be destroyed. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight is hard. A female student near the back raised her hand. Do you think the HOA president really changed, or was she just trying to save face when she apologized? I think people can change when they're forced to confront the consequences of their actions, I said. Susan lost her position, cost the HOA a lot of money, and divided the community. That's a heavy burden to carry. Whether her apology came from genuine remorse or just embarrassment, I don't know. But I chose to accept it because holding on to anger wasn't going to help anyone. The professor nodded approvingly. That's a mature perspective. Preservation battles often create lasting divisions in communities. The fact that your neighborhood was able to move past this conflict and even turn the windmill into a source of community pride is remarkable. After the class left, I spent some time doing routine maintenance on the windmill, checking the bolts and oiling the pivot points. It was meditative work, the kind of hands-on task that let my mind wander. I thought about all the unlikely twists that had brought me to this point. If my father hadn't kept the original homestead when he sold the farm, if I hadn't inherited it, if I hadn't decided to move here and restore the old farmhouse, if Susan Patterson hadn't decided to make the windmill her pet crusade, if Margaret Chen hadn't been working to identify historical landmarks right when I needed help, any one of those things could have gone differently, and the windmill might not be standing today. It was luck in a way, but it was also the result of people caring enough to do the right thing when it mattered. Weeks turned into months, and life continued its steady rhythm. The windmill stood, the neighborhood functioned peacefully under David Chen's reasonable leadership, and I settled into a comfortable routine. I'd started dating someone, a woman named Felicia Foster, who worked at the Cedar Rapids Public Library. She'd seen the documentary about the windmill and reached out to me to see if I'd be interested in doing a talk at the library about local history. Felicia was smart, funny, and shared my appreciation for preserving the past. We'd been seeing each other for about 6 months when she first told me why she'd been so drawn to the windmill story. My grandmother lost her family farm in the 80s during the farm crisis, she explained over dinner one night. The bank foreclosed, and everything was sold at auction. She always talked about this old barn her father had built, how beautiful it was, how much work he'd put into it. The people who bought the property tore it down within a year to put up a newer, cheaper building. It broke her heart. When I saw your documentary and heard how you'd fought to save your grandfather's windmill, I wished someone had fought for my great-grandfather's barn. I'm sorry that happened to your family, I said. It happened to a lot of families. That's why what you did matters. You saved something that can't be replaced. You honored your grandfather's memory and preserved a piece of history. I find that incredibly meaningful. Our relationship deepened over the following year. Felicia became a regular presence at my house, and she loved the windmill almost as much as I did. She helped me research my grandfather's history, digging through library archives to find old newspaper articles and county records from the 1940s. We discovered details about the farm I'd never known, stories about my grandfather's service in World War II, records of crop yields and livestock sales. You should really write a book about this, Felicia said one evening as we pored over old documents, not just about the windmill, but about your grandfather's whole life. The farm, the Depression, the war, building the windmill, everything. It would be a fascinating slice of Iowa history. I'm not a writer, I protested. You don't have to be. Just tell the story the way you'd tell it to me. I can help edit it. The Historical Society would probably help too. The idea stuck with me. Over the next year, I worked on writing my grandfather's story. Felicia was right. I didn't try to be a fancy writer. I just told the story as plainly and honestly as I could. I interviewed my cousin Rachel and other relatives who remembered John Sanders. I dug through old letters and photos. Slowly, a picture emerged of a complex, resilient man who'd lived through extraordinary times and left behind something tangible that had lasted. The book took 2 years to complete. It was published by a small Iowa press that specialized in local history. It wasn't a bestseller, but it sold respectably and got positive reviews. More importantly, it preserved my grandfather's story for future generations of our family. By this time, Felicia and I had gotten married. The wedding was small and held in my backyard, with the windmill serving as a dramatic backdrop. Margaret Chen came, and Patricia Wu, and David Chen, and most of the HOA board, and neighbors who'd become genuine friends over the years. Even Susan Patterson sent a card with her congratulations. Standing under the windmill with Felicia, exchanging vows in front of our friends and family, I felt connected to something larger than myself. My grandfather had built this windmill during one of the hardest periods in American history. It had survived decades of weather and neglect. I'd fought to save it from demolition, and now it stood witness as I started a new chapter of my life. "I think your grandfather would approve," Felicia whispered as we walked back down the aisle as husband and wife. "I think so too," I said, glancing up at the slowly turning blades. Years passed. The windmill remained a neighborhood landmark and a destination for history enthusiasts. The Historical Society eventually identified and protected 4 other Depression-era farm windmills in eastern Iowa, using my case as a template for how to navigate the legal and political challenges of preservation. David Chen served as HOA president for 6 years before stepping down. His successor, Tom Bradley, continued the more collaborative approach to neighborhood governance. The HOA focused on maintenance and community building rather than enforcement and punishment. The neighborhood thrived, and ironically, property values went up. Apparently, living near a historical landmark was actually desirable to many buyers, despite Susan's fears. I ran into Susan once more, about 5 years after her apology. I was at a grocery store when I saw her in the produce section. She looked older, but more relaxed, less rigid. We made eye contact, and she gave me a small smile before moving on. It was a brief moment, but it felt like a final closing of that chapter. Felicia and I had 2 children, a daughter and then a son. From the time they could walk, they loved playing near the windmill. I taught them the same maintenance routines my grandfather had taught me, passing down the knowledge of how to care for this piece of family history. They'd grown up hearing stories about John Sanders, about the Depression and the farm, about the HOA battle and the landmark designation. "Will the windmill be mine someday?" my daughter asked me when she was 8 years old. "It'll belong to whoever lives here," I said, "but it's protected now. It's not just our families anymore. It belongs to history." "That's good," she said seriously. "More people should get to see it." On the 10th anniversary of the day, the contractors had shown up to tear down the windmill. The Historical Society organized an official commemoration. They'd arranged for the governor to visit and officially recognize the windmill's importance to Iowa's agricultural heritage. It was a bigger production than I had expected. There were news cameras, a podium, folding chairs set up in my backyard. About 200 people showed up, including representatives from preservation groups across the state, local politicians, neighbors, and history enthusiasts. The governor gave a speech about the importance of preserving Iowa's agricultural history, about how structures like my grandfather's windmill told the story of the people who'd built this state. He talked about resilience and ingenuity and the need to remember where we came from even as we moved forward into the future. Then it was my turn to speak. I stood at the podium, looking out at all those faces, and for a moment I was overwhelmed. 10 years ago, I'd been standing on my porch watching contractors prepare to destroy this windmill. I'd been angry and scared and uncertain whether I could save it. And now, here we were, celebrating its preservation and its place in Iowa's history. "My grandfather built this windmill with his own hands in 1942, I began. He couldn't have imagined that 80-some years later, the governor of Iowa would be standing here talking about it. He built it because he needed it, because water was scarce, and money was scarce, and he had to find a way to keep his farm going. He built it to last, using whatever materials he could find and all the skill he had." I paused, looking up at the windmill towering above us. 10 years ago, I almost lost it, not to time or weather or decay, but to a homeowners association that saw it as an eyesore. What saved it was the state of Iowa recognizing its historical significance and protecting it by law. But what also saved it was people in this community who stood up and said that history matters more than conformity, that some things are worth preserving even if they don't fit someone's idea of how a neighborhood should look. I talked about Margaret Chen and the Historical Society, about Patricia Wu's legal expertise, about the neighbors who'd supported me, about David Chen's leadership in healing the community after the conflict. I thanked everyone who'd played a role in saving the windmill and ensuring it would be here for future generations. This windmill represents more than just my family's history, I concluded. It represents the history of thousands of Iowa families who struggled through hard times and built things that lasted. Every old barn, every historical building, every landmark that we preserve is a connection to those people and their stories. Thank you all for helping me save this one. The applause was generous and sustained. As I stepped away from the podium, my daughter grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. "Good speech, Dad," she said. After the ceremony ended and most people had left, I stood alone with the windmill one more time. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The blades turned slowly, creaking in their familiar rhythm. I thought about everything that had happened since that morning 10 years ago when I'd confronted those contractors in my driveway. The fights and stress, the court hearings, the community conflict, the eventual resolution and Susan's apology, the restoration and the landmark designation, the documentary, the book, the marriage, the children, all of it connected to this one structure, this pile of metal and wood that my grandfather had assembled decades before I was born. What had started as a simple desire to protect a piece of family history had turned into something much larger. The windmill had become a symbol of successful preservation, a teaching example, a community landmark. It had brought people together and taught lessons about what matters and what's worth fighting for. My grandfather had built something that lasted, just as I'd toasted at that celebration years ago. But more than that, he'd built something that meant something, something that connected past to present to future. That was his real legacy, and I was honored to be its temporary steward. The windmill would outlast me, just as it had outlasted my grandfather and my father. Someday my children would stand where I was standing, looking up at it and remembering their family's history. And maybe their children would do the same. As long as people cared about preserving the past, as long as we remembered why these connections to history mattered, the windmill would continue to stand. I walked back toward the house, where Felicia was waiting with the kids. Behind me, the windmill stood sentinel against the darkening sky, its blades turning in the evening wind, just as they had for more than 80 years, just as they would, I hoped, for 80 more.